Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Dimitri Abrams. I'm the head of archives at the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Victoria Walden. Victoria is a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex. Her research interests are Holocaust and genocide, nonfiction, and animated films, digital memory in museums, and film philosophy. She has worked with the Holocaust Educational Trust, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and has volunteered for the Wiener Library and Jewish Museum in London. In her talk tonight, Victoria will interrogate certain myths about the digital to propose potential ways in which it can be used in productive ways to encourage Holocaust memory. This talk is especially pertinent for the situation the world currently finds itself in. Holocaust museums around the world are turning to the digital to provide educational content and resources for people stuck at home. As such, we hope that this talk sparks some idea of how this can be achieved. Victoria will stay online for 5 minutes after the talk to answer any questions that you may have. Please follow us on social media to stay up to date on all our events. And now, without further ado, over to Victoria.
Thank you, Dimitri. I apologize for my cough as well. I hope it's not too distracting today. So my talk today is called Debunking Digital Myths, What's So New About New Media Experiences with Holocaust Memory. I thank you very much for joining me from wherever you are and at whatever time it is where you are. I'm currently situated about 3 minutes walk from the British South Coast seaside, and as typically British, it's raining here. Geographical and temporal distance has become characteristic of most of our social counters in these strange times. Life has rapidly moved pretty much completely online in 2020. And of course, it's not just our day-to-day experiences that are increasingly digital. This year is an important year for Holocaust remembrance. Whilst commemorative events marking the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz were held at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum back in January, the liberation of other camps since, notably Bergen-Belsen earlier this month, have been commemorated online only. And I'm just going to share with you, bear with me, a quick video here. So this was the reflaying of Bergen-Belsen earlier this month with no visitors there. This was the video they put up. So there's a website that Bergen-Belsen have created of snippets of some of the talks and of the reflaying as a kind of alternative to what would have been a pilgrimage for many people and a ritualistic communal memorial laying. In the UK, this year's Yom HaShoah events promoted the motto, "Remember together, we are one," which felt somewhat ironic as people took to lighting candles in their own homes alone. Yet the simultaneity of their ritualistic actions, shared on Twitter and provoked by the lighting of candles on a YouTube live stream, suggests that perhaps we can still be together when physically alone. Whilst the internet is often considered immaterial and ephemeral, this is just one example in which digital communication has enabled very physical, ritualistic, and social behaviors in which humans use tangible objects, here the act of lighting a candle. We are not living in a completely virtual form of reality yet. Indeed, the research I am working on argues that many of our presumptions about what defines the digital are in fact misinterpretations of its essences. Many of the terms that we relate to the digital, such as immersion, interactivity, and virtuality, existed as part of our everyday and also our memory practices, long before the arrival of the commercial internet or the introduction of technologies into museums and archives. And in the limited time of today's talk, I'll focus on the three key terms I just mentioned: immersion, interactivity, and virtuality in relation to Holocaust memory. Of course, there are many more terms that we could talk about today. My aim is not simply to lambast some of the excellent work that is happening in relation to this topic, but rather to evaluate the extent to which digital technologies are needed to do such work. This project is very much in its infancy, and my hope by the end of it is that by better understanding the essence of the digital and the computational, we might be able to discover the radical potential it may have for Holocaust memory. And as the Holocaust is increasingly moving beyond living memory, and although we are fortunate to have many survivors across the globe still regularly sharing their stories, we are moving, as James Young has noted, towards an era of mediated Holocaust memory, in an epoch in which we can only remember this past through and with media. And so I want to start by briefly interrogating where the idea of the digital as something radically new came from. Michael Stevenson in 2016 mapped the belief in the new through the digital age to the mid-1990s .com era and the promise of an internet-powered democratizing media. This same revolutionary idea about the digital re-emerged with the social media of Web 2.0, the participatory internet culture, which was going to make broadcast media obsolete. Now, in many countries today, I'm sure, I don't know if it's the same in South Africa, we are facing droll daily press conferences from government officials. Despite the dominance of digital media in everyday life, broadcast media is certainly not dead yet. Stevenson argues that concept of the digital as new and innovative and the idea of the digital native emerged from two cyberculture magazines, Mondo 2000 and Wired. And these magazines helped bring into view and shape the new media field as it emerged in the early and mid-1990s. And as such, we have come to accept that the digital is radically new, revolutionary and disruptive, because digital opinion leaders, those invested in digital publications like Wired and Mondo 2000 and working in the industry, told us so. If we wanted to be in the know, we wanted to be cool, and we wanted to be on trend, we had to adapt our habits and our language to become natives in their digital culture. And thus we're not really natives in any way at all. And it is particularly interesting that the idea of disruption is now sold as a marketing and business strategy, which suggests that disruption is the norm rather than actually disrupting anything at all. This dot-com boom of the 1990s was also influenced by techno-utopians like Marshall McLuhan, the celebrity of media studies. And he was writing as early as the 1960s about the revolutionary potential of electronic media. Whilst McLuhan did not think that new media would eradicate all of our social ills and stressed that it might create new ones, he nevertheless believed it would enable the birth of a global village, bringing us closer together socially and culturally. Yet other media theorists have been skeptical of these claims that the digital is so radically new. Lisa Gittelman has compared the phonograph to the internet, Alison Griffin's the immersive experience of cathedrals to IMAX screenings in science museums, and Anna Alakovska user-generated content from 19th century travel guidebooks to TripAdvisor. Some of the attempts to define what is actually new about so-called new media have concluded that perhaps its very newness is that it's not new at all. For example, Jay Bolter and Richard Grusin argue that the digital tends to rely more heavily on remediating more traditional media. For example, we can watch television on our computer screen. And whilst Lev Manovich offers criteria that distinguishes the computational from earlier media forms, he has been criticized for how often he keeps falling back on comparisons to cinema. And what I hope to add to this body of work is an exploration of how new, so-called new media interventions in memorial museums and archives might be. So let us turn to the first of the key terms that I mentioned, which is interactivity. The audiences of traditional broadcast media were passive and digital audiences are active. This is one of the biggest myths we try to drill out of students' minds in media and film studies classrooms. Audiences were never entirely passive. Early news sheets were circulated in coffee shops where the emerging business class would discuss and debate their content. In what Jürgen Habermas first defined as an example of the modern public sphere. This became a fundamental characteristic of democracy as we know it, albeit a very select number of people were informing public decision making. People would write in with contributions to travel guidebooks and let newspapers know their views on recent reporting. And these were often then shared and printed by the newspapers. Furthermore, we must not assume that physical activity by audiences or users using digital technology equates to political and cultural agency. Henry Jenkins celebrates participatory online culture for making us what he calls producers, by which he means we become both producers and users simultaneously. Yet, as cultural theorist Jodie Dean attests, much of the content we produce online is brief and antagonistic. We like to yell at people we disagree with on social media, but we're not particularly interested in engaging in meaningful debate with them in ways that might encourage social political change. Furthermore, Christian Fuchs argues that the production work we do online is free labor, which gives profit and power to corporations rather than empowering us. And whilst touchscreens and mobile apps certainly appear, literally on the surface, to engage users more interactively than older technological forms, or in fact non-media engagements, spectators and museum visitors have always been active. As phenomenologists in film, culture and media studies protest, we engage our body interactively when we watch something, even if we appear to be sat still. Think about how your hairs might come on end or your heartbeat fasten. Cognitivists like David Bordwell also note that we're constantly engaging in mental processing, reading for clues, negotiating previous knowledge with current experience as we watch a film. And this is also true, is it not, for museum experiences? Digital technology often seems to offer users choices. For example, which button to press, which order to press the buttons in, which route to follow. But the sense of agency here is somewhat illusionary. There is still only a limited number of pathways programmed into the app, as there are limited routes through an object-heavy museum. Some digital displays, for example, those that are incorporated into Block 27 at the Auschwitz State Museum, are still bound within the directed routes of the physical space. Where I can roam in the virtual tour of the State Museum is entirely limited by the programming of the app. And I'll just show you an example of this space. So here is the virtual tour of Auschwitz I. And as you can see, I start off with the bird's eye view, I come down, and already I start to feel a slight disorientation. I've been to this site myself now, I think more than 20 times, and I find it very difficult to guide around the space. And I can only point and move where the arrows allow me. So if I now want to go down here, I find that I'm limited. I can only follow where the app wants me to go. So very much like if any of you have been to the State Museum, the arrows that guide you around each of the buildings. We also see an incredibly active form of museum experience in what's been called the Participatory Museum Manifesto. And this encouraged a break away from the traditions of the do not touch exhibition space to activities in which visitors, perhaps controversially, are encouraged to play with, break down, and reinvent museum objects in ways that make historical things meaningful to them. In such experimental spaces, visitors are encouraged to become responsible for meaning making in interactive ways that do not necessarily require digital intervention. Nevertheless, one form of interactive digital Holocaust memory is the USC Shoah Foundation's IWitness. And this is a platform which allows school pupils to create their own videos from a selection of testimony clips, enabling them to become memory producers, as they must think critically about which elements of different videos they paste together to create a memory of the Holocaust that is meaningful to them. And I'll just show you a quick trailer from their website.
Imagine if there were a voice that spoke to our generation and could guide us through the dark chapters of human history. Imagine if that voice could help us think about our values, our society, and our own attitudes and behaviors. Imagine if we could take that voice of human conscience and transform the way our generation learns. We do have that voice. In fact, there are nearly 52,000 of those voices in the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, and 1,200 of them can be in our classrooms with IWitness. IWitness is designed for teachers and their students, locally or globally. IWitness activities address education standards, such as Common Core, and makes learning relevant and engaging.
Kids and myself have been raised on video. And so when you can see somebody in video talking about their life experiences, I think naturally we make that connection.
Because it uses the compelling stories from the video testimonies in an online platform, using IWitness builds digital, media, and other literacies critical to student success in the 21st century.
I view IWitness as such a dynamic tool for empowering for students to have layered reading, writing, communication, back and forth with their peers.
Students will like what they can do in IWitness: searching, watching, listening, learning, building word clouds, and producing multimedia activities.
Somebody came to the barrack and said, "Who is a painter?" And somebody pointed at me.
She was at an extermination camp, got out, and then worked for Walt Disney, who makes cartoons that almost everybody knows.
Sorry, Dimitri's just told me that you can't see that film. I apologise there. I'll see if I can play them through the PowerPoint and see if that works. If it goes straight to the link.
Imagine if there were a voice that spoke to our generation and could guide.
I'll leave this clip and try and play some more ones. There's always technical glitches when we're communicating across the world, and always ironically when we're talking about digital media. With IWitness, what students can do is take clips from the virtual history archive that's run by the USC Shoah Foundation, and make their own multimedia project. So they can take clips, sound bites, etc., and make their own narrative. They can also make word clouds. So it gets them thinking in perhaps what we might think of as a networked way. They're searching a database and finding different things, but creating their own narrative out of that and picking what they feel is meaningful to them about this past. Interactivity can also rely on entanglement between human and machine, in which the machine may make choices as well as the user. One example of this is the USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive, and not just in its IWitness platform. And Todd Presner argues that tagging and algorithmic logics in the archive have enabled lesser known experiences of the Holocaust to come to the foreground of searches, disrupting canons of knowledge. For example, human users will often search for well-known individuals such as Anne Frank when they're faced with the interface. And here's an example. This is just a chapter from the Presner reading where he shows how different themes can link you to people who are hardly looked at in the archive normally by people typing in the name. Now, this kind of relationship between human and machine can have wonderful consequences, such as expanding our knowledge and memory of the Holocaust. However, as we know in the case of social media, choices made through computational logic can either broaden or narrow our perceptual and intellectual horizons. And we should always be aware of their limitations as we embrace their opportunities. For example, Facebook and YouTube are renowned for prioritizing what they think we want to see, thus creating echo chambers for us, which limit our engagement with a variety of perspectives and topics. But what are we to think about giving agency over to the machines? Recent research by the Excavating AI project team reveals how contemporary machine learning of images exposes racial and gender prejudices that were also inherent in earlier computer projects and, of course, in pre-computational life. An example of an earlier form they give was the IBM Central Database that stored racial categories during apartheid. Now, to what extent is it ethical to use such technologies in museums and archives, focused particularly on genocide memory? Do we need to rethink how we teach machines to learn? After all, machine learning is inherently human. At the base of it are the humans coding the keywords into the machines. Now, some questions that arise then when we are thinking about interactivity and the digital might include the following. To what extent does the introduction of the digital give users agency rather than simply activity? How might it be able to encourage them to become political and ethical agents of Holocaust memory rather than just play with technology? And to what extent does the introduction of the digital encourage productively disruptive ways to rethink Holocaust memory? Or could the way in which the digital is encouraging decision-making be restrictive and enforce a particular ideology rather than open up critical thought? I want to think about a couple of more examples of interactivity in Holocaust memory now. And now I will share the right screen with you. So the first example here is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Crystal Nut exhibition, which was in Second Life, which now seems quite old. Hopefully this will work.
Someone knocked on the door and told my father that he and his brother and my grandfather should not go to the synagogue that day because something terrible was coming down.
I walked to school, I saw the Jewish windows of the Jewish schools broken. I saw already in the distance the smoke. The more first I didn't know what it meant, but then I realized that
We saw our synagogue on fire, smoke coming out. And then we turned on the radio and we heard the news that most of the synagogues were on fire. And we shouldn't go out of the house. Jews should stay in the house. Don't go outside by our synagogue. And all I remember is hordes of people standing in front of it was called the Bornplatz synagogue, the big synagogue of Hamburg. And it had not been set on fire. And it wasn't set on fire. But they were standing in front of it, throwing stones through the beautiful stained glass. I think that they had gotten into the synagogue and ransacked it on the inside.
Okay, and what we see here is not so much a digital simulation completely of the past, but a simulation of a space that could be a physical exhibition space within a museum. The example here, you see someone move their avatar around the space, and yet they have very little agency. They're roaming around a curated space. The glass shatters and falls around them. Earlier papers have littered the floor. The testimonies play out to them as they walk. The participant here is not taking part in a historical reenactment, but is also not given the opportunity to create their own memory narrative in the present either. So although it seems like an interactive activity, it's a computer game, more or less, it's not really interactive in any sense that gives us agency. Another example is the story pods at the Melbourne Holocaust Centre, the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne rather. And the screens here are situated, as you can see, within the museum. And they expand the museum's narrative by allowing users to click on objects or photographs, for example, or pick the stories of particular survivors. And it really kind of serves as a find out more, an extension of the limits of the physical museum itself. And like the Crystal Nut exhibition, it's still content created by the institution. And that's like the Crystal Nut exhibition, It presents what we should call institutional memory, following a kind of broadcast logic, rather than offering a collaborative and interactive experience, which involves both museums and visitors as creative agents of memory production. And it is that kind of interactivity that we have come to think about as kind of characteristic of what the digital is. In the next section about virtuality, I'll explore some digital examples that open up critical space through their use of the digital. I'm going to talk a little bit about philosophy here, and I apologize because I know it's an hour later on Thursday evening where you are than where I am. Philosophers like Henry Bergson and Gilles Deleuze remind us that virtuality was fundamental to the experience of existence, a long time before digital virtual reality was conceived. In their writing, both French thinkers argue that memory is virtual, that any given moment in time splits into what they call the actual, the moment as in its present and as it's passing forward, and the virtual, the moment as it moves into the past, and in which moment memory is created or can be created. Matthew Boswell's recent AHSC project, Virtual Holocaust Memory, explores digital memorialization of this past, yet the virtual does not always relate to the digital, and it can refer to projects that are not digital. And in some recent work I published with memory studies, I've tried to reframe this idea of virtual Holocaust memory as works that adopt a methodology to memorialization that reflects on this split, not only between the actual and virtual in their own moment of time, but the actual now, i.e. experiencing a site of memorialization, and the virtual of the movement towards a past, which we cannot attempt to absolutely re-actualize in the present as if it was here, which in our case is the Holocaust. Some museum spaces adopt what I would call a living history environment, which I'll explain more towards the end of this talk. And in these cases might be described as trying to obtain this reactualization, trying to create a space that looks like a moment from the Holocaust. But reactualizing that past is of course unachievable, and it should be. And these spaces are empty of the very people that their historical counterparts affected in horrific ways. These are, of course, unlike living history museums where actors pretend to take on the roles of the people from the past, but nevertheless, they still have a resonance of looking like times from the Holocaust. However, there are numerous digital and non-digital projects that I have claimed emphasize this split between the actual and virtual by drawing our attention to the unobtainable past, to physical absences in our visual horizon, not just as gaps missing from their representation, as people in trauma studies often talk about, but as the focal point to which we're asked to attend, to identify ourselves within this space. They draw us into movements towards the past without suggesting they can fully take us there, and yet emphasize the split and the simultaneous entanglement that occurs in memory between past, present, and future. By positioning us in this kind of weird liminal in-between space, I have argued that such projects tend to open up critical space to encourage the user or visitor to become an agent for Holocaust memory by taking on some of the responsibility for it. And indeed, indeterminacy, or this kind of being in between, is often thought as quite characteristic of computational logic. So the next slide I'm going to show you is an example of one of these. And this is the Here Space for Memory augmented reality app at Bergen-Belsen. And this app seems to call for us to take an archaeological attention. Visitors develop this dispersed attention of the site between the screen and the app. The lived world of the almost empty site at the former camp, Bergen-Belsen, encourages a searching attitude as we raise the iPad up in front of these empty fields, or mostly empty fields, and then look at these computer-based models on the screen. And yet, what I find really fascinating about these structures that we see, they're unfinished. They look like the kind of early testing or kind of layout models that you might use when you're developing a computer game. They're certainly not photorealist. And this was intentional for the very reason to not make people feel like they were traveling back into the past. So we do not experience a reenactment of what Bergen-Belsen was at any particular time of its functioning history, but we're forced to recognize that we're positioned between past and present, And we're bodily moving between the representation on the app and the lived environment we're situated with in the present. And the differences start to make us ask questions. And thus we're asked to also take some of the ethical responsibility for memory of this site. Another example is the Auschwitz app by the Auschwitz Jewish Center in Poland. And such a sensation is similarly provoked by this app, which draws attention to the differences in the Polish town of Oswiecim, famous for being the town where Auschwitz-Birkenau and Auschwitz I are. And it's now compared to the pre-war period when its population was 52% Jewish, and the app shows us some important sites to the Jewish community during that period, and today when no Jews live here. What's particularly powerful about this app is as you walk around the town and you use the map here and the GPS to find your sites, you hold the phone up and can look at photographs in comparison to the world around you. But the photographs, of course, are still, and the townscape before us is very lively. So between past and present, stillness and movement, we once again, as with at Bergen-Belsen, find our body in a space in between, from which it must engage critically with memory. Yet, as I argued or claimed previously, virtual Holocaust memory projects do not have to be digital. The same affect or effect of opening up a critical space in which users or visitors can take on some of the responsibility for Holocaust memory and do this in a bodily way, can also be stimulated by analog and physical objects. And to show you one example of this, this exhibition of holograms that used to be at the Vienna Jewish Museum. And these were developed as an analog form. Holograms are becoming quite trendy again in their digital incarnations. Now, unfortunately, the holograms were accidentally broken during the museum's move to a new venue. But before that moment, they served as an exhibition of pre-war Jewish life in the Austrian capital. Yet the technology used for their display also provokes a sense they were simultaneously about the Holocaust. And this provocation was entirely reliant on the bodily movement of visitors. As one moved past a hologram, it might appear and then disappear, creating only a brief ghosting image of the past, Vienna's pre-war Jewish life, which would temporarily appear in our perceptual horizon. So the final key term I said I'd talk about today is immersion. Now, whilst it might be argued that immersion can be achieved through the use of virtual reality technology, and we often hear these words used together, it's also true of the living history environments I previously mentioned. In her extensive work on museum spaces, Alison Griffiths defines immersion, and I quote, as a sense of being in close communion with something other than the here and now, something that takes us into a virtual reality that could be defined by the interstitial space. We are never fully there because our bodies can never fully leave the here. And she argues that alongside IMAX screens in science museums, cathedrals, and other pre-digital communal spaces could offer immersive experiences too. For her, many museums are also already immersive because they offer what she calls total environments. But such environments did not emerge with digital objects. And yet, as Bolter and Gruson acknowledge, when the digital does offer immersion potential, the reality effect, creating closed spaces, we are also generally always aware of the hypermediacy. The poor quality graphics of contemporary VR points to this, the heavy headset on our face, our phone running out of battery. We're very aware of the media that we're using to look at what we see as some kind of reality or total environment. Unlike Griffiths, I would also argue that the virtual, and I use this as I used it in the last section in the Bergsonian and Deleuzian sense, is actually counter to immersion, as it is practiced by digital creators and museums. Total environments tend to give us an impression that we're almost in the world they represent, never quite, usually because of the absence of authentic living people from the time. Nevertheless, they attempt to reactualize the past, at least architecturally. Now, in contrast, the virtual Holocaust memory projects I mentioned before highlight their inability to do this. There was a growing body of work, such as that by my colleague Beatrice Farsi, which tries to separate the virtual from the computational. Farsi argues that many digital media theorists, such as Mark Hansen, who was influenced by Bergson, and writes about the effect of the digital and relates the virtual to the continuity of time, sensation, and effect when we use digital things. Yet for Farsi, the fundamental characteristic of the computational is its discreteness, not its sense of continuity. And if continuity is virtual, then computational is something else. And thinking about interruption, difference, and discontinuity then might be ways of doing Holocaust memory that are particularly digital. And what might that look like? I leave that as a rhetorical question for now. But I want to think about immersion in relation to two case studies. One that is digital, which I argue actually avoids immersion, and another physical, which attempts to be more immersive. The first of these is a VR testimony, Lost Goodbye, which might offer a sense that users can immerse themselves in Majdanek. And we see here one of the virtual reality environments from the film. However, sensitively, it does not try to go back to Majdanek as a functioning camp, but rather Majdanek, the memorial site. Thus, it promises immersion in a space geographically rather than historically distant. Last Goodbye, then, maintains a sense of difference and discontinuity between past and present. However, is this really immersion? We are ever aware of the many different planes of time and place we are engaging with when viewing the testimony. The museum space in the US in which the VR testimony is available to watch, the site Majdanek as both historical place and memory space, and the testimony which points to historical moments. But as with all testimony, can only be delivered after the event to which it discusses. Now, a contrasting, perhaps, form of immersion then is that several Holocaust memorial museums have attempted to create what I call physical living history environments. Environments is the key word here, again, just to emphasize, because people or actors do not roam these sites, or at least people from the time. However, this does not make them deadened history environments, for they require us, the living, breathing visitors, to travel through them. And in doing so, they ask us to experience them as historical simulations. We are invited to walk as if stepping on the ground of the Warsaw Ghetto, as if walking through a German street. These immersive spaces attempt to encourage the visitor to empathize with victims, and perhaps in problematic ways. Whilst Jennifer Glucklich, in her words about Holocaust museums, has suggested that objects are fundamental for bridging the gap between past and present and provoking this empathy, there is a possibility that visitors leave feeling too close to a victim experience, which is not theirs to feel, rather than contemplating how they might act in times in which minorities in their community are persecuted. The lesson never again relies on us thinking about our own actions or inactions. In contrast, The Last Goodbye seems to have more carefully considered the ethics of immersion and avoided the idea of being a total environment. Questions like, to what extent is it appropriate to give visitors the impression that they are walking in the footsteps of those who are in a ghetto or camp? Can the reality effect be justified here? These are all the kind of questions this app seems to ask, or film, virtual reality film. And counter to the examples in the physical museums, The Last Goodbye offers users the opportunity to access a memorial site that's hard to reach in ways that continually remind them of not only the geographical differences, but the temporal as well. And so in this way, it's digital, but perhaps not necessarily immersive, and yet is quite computational in drawing attention to things like discontinuity, whereas immersive environments, we tend to think of giving continuity. So to offer something of a conclusion, and this is a very tiny part of a much bigger project, and very much the beginning of this project as well, but I would argue that the digital does not fundamentally offer something radically new or innovative, or necessarily something absolutely needed to engage young and future generations, which has often been the way it's been framed. Nevertheless, several logics existed before the digital that continue to persist within it, and these include immersion, virtuality, and interactivity. To think about a Holocaust memory for the future is to think about how, why, and if the digital is necessary, and of course where. Given the increasing concerns about the environment, we do have a duty to reflect upon this, and particularly given the increase in developments in digital technology quickly makes platforms, file types, and store mechanisms obsolete. And as we're increasingly becoming aware at the moment, there are huge differences in the accessibility audiences may have to data and to the technology and the interfaces required. Also, it's necessary to think about the extent to which different digital projects encourage users or visitors to become critical, responsible agents of Holocaust memory, to become participatory in this digital way. As the Holocaust moves beyond living memory, continuation of its memory relies on cultivating future generations of responsible memory agents, able to navigate the past for themselves in ways that are meaningful for them. The digital is one tool that could be helpful in this sense, but it's also not perhaps the only way. And the logics we apply to the digital, many of them already exist in other forms too. And it's also possible to use the digital like we use traditional media as a broadcast medium, as I am now. As we sit here communicating solely online, it seems like now is as better time as ever to think more reflectively about how and why we can best use digital technologies, and given the significance of 2020, especially in relation to Holocaust memory and education. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to ask and to answer them now. And also, if you think of questions later, do feel free to get in contact on Twitter.
Okay, we don't have any questions. Can't see any questions coming through. No.
I think Linda has raised her hand.
Okay, yeah, yeah. What's your question, Linda? Okay, sure. Linda just wants me to unmute her. Let's just try to unmute her quickly. Okay, I can't seem to unmute her, so she's just gonna type the question.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Okay, there we go. Yeah.
I'm typing away. Oh, this is much better. Okay. Hi, Victoria. I hope you can't see me because I'm in my pajamas. But but I wanted to ask you the following. You know, you spoke about that IWitness thing where kids can come and listen and to survivors and then take bits and create their own kind of story. And I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that. You know, I'm kind of thinking if someone took my family story and someone else's family story, and I'm not even talking about Holocaust, and then sort of bung them together to create a South African Jewish story, I might be a little uncomfortable about that. And I'm deeply uncomfortable about people's Holocaust experiences and memories being sort of cut and pasted in a way.
I think that's a really a worthwhile concern, and I think offer two different ways of thinking about what they're doing here. So they have I haven't seen the project. I've seen it online. I haven't seen it being used by school children in the US. I've played with it myself, but I have used it with other people. There's there's one that's similar to it in the educational space in the Block 27 in the Auschwitz State Museum. And the idea is that you take themes. So if a young person, I don't know, is trying to, I'm trying to think of an example very late at night, you'll forgive my umming. So think about things around work or diet or hunger, and is trying to understand this as a concept in a particular space. The idea is that the archive has metadata that tags certain clips within archives, within testimonies, and the students can pull them together. Now, I think you're right that this idea that you could create some kind of metonymic narrative as representational as all people's experience is problematic. And I suppose I'm not trying to argue that one is more ethical than the other, but that one is more digital or computational in its logic. So that kind of networked thinking is much more digital, kind of searching for similarities and tags. And I think the idea there is not that you create a singular narrative, but then you get, say, 20 different voices about the experience of trying to eat at Auschwitz.
Yeah, I understand that now, and that makes a lot more sense. And in fact, it's not unlike the holograms or the virtual survivor testimony, where they've got all this sort of metadata, and a word will trigger a response or a memory. So, okay, I get that.
And I apologize.
Thank you. That makes a lot more sense. Yeah, no, that makes a lot more sense to me. Thank you.
Okay. I actually have a question. If you'll indulge me. So you wrote about a movie called Lego Holocaust a few years ago. And amongst the staff at the Holocaust Center, we have spoken about this movie and its role in Holocaust memory. Do you think that is a useful tool to use with, not to use, but to engage with the ways in which young people remember the Holocaust? So like you have a group of teachers and you show them this movie and you say to them, you know, this is one way in which young people these days remember the Holocaust. Do you think that's useful, or is it no longer useful? Was it ever useful?
I knew Lego Holocaust was going to come back to haunt me.
Yes.
So it's interesting. And so I'll just give some context for anyone who hasn't seen what these films are. They are, there's a range of different reasons people have made them. There's a Lego Holocaust is one of them. There's Lego Auschwitz. There's a range of them. And they mostly seem to have been school projects where a school has said, you know, you can write an essay or you can respond in another way. And students who very much like making Lego and like stop motion films turn to their medium, their artistic talent to interpret their understanding of the Holocaust through it. And there's this kind of horrible jarring in moments of violence where you have kind of plasticine and bizarre kind of accents added by kind of 9, 11-year-old children to Lego narratives about gas chambers or about shootings. I don't necessarily think they're useful as a learning tool. I think what I was trying to write about at the time is what they tell us about how young people understand the Holocaust. And I'm thinking about the Hunters series that's on Amazon Prime. At the moment, there's had a lot of controversy, and the Auschwitz Museum have kind of written out some public statements about the problems they have with it. And both that and the Lego films seem to come back to moments of violence, and quite graphic moments of violence, and often kind of fictional or kind of symbolic scenes of violence. And I think one of the things that strikes me with those, and a lot of these kind of very contemporary, third generation or later, I suppose, representations, is that museums, and from when I used to work in Holocaust education as well, one of our kind of mottos as such was not to show horrific images. That this kind of desensitizes against violence, it's unnecessary, it's not fair to the victims in the image as well. And yet it seems to be these moments of violence that younger people are really interested in, that makes them think about the Holocaust. You know, whether that's this kind of glamorization of violence in media, maybe, but maybe there's something else. Maybe it's the fact that they're shielded from the violence, and this way understanding it as such a violent event that they're able to think about it as something that they really need to remember, given it was so far away from their time. And I think it's not my expertise, but I think it would be really interesting to have some pedagogical research and trying to understand why these students make these films.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, can I interject? Can I say something?
Of course.
The fact that they are 12-year-old boys tells you all you need to know really about why they're making these sort of things. And I think that's where the problem for me comes in. What do they actually know? They don't know much. They know about gas chambers and shooting things. That's all they know. So if that's what you're going into this with, how can you possibly expect anything but what they do? And that's where I have a problem. Yeah, with the, I mean, actually thought you had made that little thing, Victoria.
Oh no,
so
I have never made.
No.
Very clear. I have not made a film using Lego about it. I could not afford the Lego, even if I wanted to. No. I wrote an article many years ago now during my PhD. And what I was trying to say in the article was that the way children are interpreted, or not just children, but younger people. I mean, the maker of Hunters is not young. It's not a 12-year-old boy. He's third generation Holocaust survivor. His grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and he's an adult making this very kind of ultraviolet film. But I was trying to kind of say that perhaps we need to rethink the ethics of how we think about Holocaust representation and memory with young people, and try and understand what it is different about this generation, who will, as adults, be the first generation to experience the Holocaust beyond living memory. Now, we're very fortunate to have lots of contact with Holocaust survivors in our lives in person, and they won't have that, or their children won't have that when we come kind of 20, 30 years down the line. And perhaps thinking about how they, on this kind of transitional point, are engaging with memory of the Holocaust and representing the Holocaust would allow us to rethink what the boundaries are of those ethics. And it used to be kind of Elie Wiesel and Terence Dupree's kind of rules about representation that have framed much of what we do. But those are now, I think Dupree's was writing in the 80s, Wiesel in the 70s. So we're talking quite historical, and these are times that these young people are really distant from, right?
Okay, that makes sense. Is there anybody else who has a question? No, doesn't look like it. Thank you very much, Victoria. This was very enlightening talk. Gave me lots to think about. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Linda's clapping hands for you. Okay.
Have a good
Thank
evening.
you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.